This week's Gamer's Guide to Feminism could possibly be the most confusing one because we get into some pretty dense theory. Feminist thought didn't just stop at the beginning of World War I and start up again in the 1960s. The idea of gender as a social construct, the precursors to modern gaze and sexual objectification theory, the idea of woman as other, and the concept, if not the term, the personal as political, all came from a single book published in 1949, Le Deuxième Sexe, or The Second Sex. The author of The Second Sex was the complicated and brilliant Simone de Beauvoir, a French feminist who didn't identify as feminist until the 1970s. She was a Western Marxist who still dismissed angles on the issue of female subordination. She was a philosopher who never considered herself a philosopher. Simone de Beauvoir could have been one of the first confirmed cases of the phenomenon common among successful women known as imposter syndrome, a collection of feelings of inadequacy that persist even in the face of information that indicates the opposite is true. De Beauvoir's inability to see herself as a thinker in her own right, despite the treasure trove of groundbreaking ideas found in The Second Sex, is a pretty good indicator of imposter syndrome. Sure, she borrowed from Kant, I said Kant, Marx, Engels, Freud, and Alfred Adler, who came up with the idea of an inferiority complex, but her combination of their theories was new work, so her feelings of inadequacy compared to her longtime partner, Jean-Paul Sartre, are curious. Granted, Sartre's ideas on consciousness, choice, and action are important in game design, but so are de Beauvoir's ideas about the construction of identity. De Beauvoir combined the personal, the political, and the philosophical regarding the ideas of femininity and womanhood in a way that was new. When she dove into history for The Second Sex, she could find no good historical reason why women became subordinate to men, and determined that gender was not biologically driven, but a social construct. Possibly her most famous quote is, "One is not born, but rather becomes a woman." This means that our idea of womanhood is a collection of behaviors and social norms that have little to do with the biological state of being female. This was the point where biological sex, what plumbing you have between your legs, and gender, what the world tells you that plumbing means, separated from each other in human understanding. A central existentialist problem is the conflict between the concept of absolute moral freedom and observable constraints of circumstance. De Beauvoir made it clear that women of her time had no concept of freedom separate from constraints of circumstance. This is the core of the feminist fixation with agency. De Beauvoir was a woman ahead of her time. She refused traditional marriage and was illogically repulsed by the feminine ability to reproduce. She saw reproduction as a curse. But one of the most amazing things about de Beauvoir is something more radical feminists could use a lesson in: an openness to evolutions in thinking. She was exceptionally prepared to admit and rectify what she saw as her own mistakes throughout her career. Now, granted, I think she overdid her self-criticism. By the mid-1970s, she already saw The Second Sex as no longer relevant, but it is important to keep in mind that just because a book is influential doesn't mean it's 100% right. The amazing thing about The Second Sex is that anything of use remains at all. The Second Sex has been called madly sensible and brilliantly confused, which is to be expected from a work from a time before Roe v. Wade and Title IX. It's hard for us to completely relate to the period before the second wave of feminism because the world changed so much during the second wave of feminism. And Simone de Beauvoir was one of the architects that laid out the preliminary blueprints for that change. So let's dig into de Beauvoir so we can really get a sense of some of the things that inform major feminist ideas. Of course, we'll do this using video game examples. A significant issue in talking about gaming is that a gamer is assumed to be white, straight, cisgendered, and male. Women are considered a second sex in gaming, even by those who claim to advocate for us. So why is this a bad thing? Because it leads to women thinking of ourselves as perpetual outsiders in the video game industry, minimizing our responses and opinions, even though some of us have been enthusiastically playing video games most of our lives. It also allowed a popular myth to grow that video games were, until recently, designed primarily for men. The truth is that gaming during the arcade era was designed to appeal to both men and women to make arcades date night destinations. Popular arcade games like Pac-Man and Centipede were specifically designed to appeal to women. Pac-Man was designed with the Japanese kawaii, or cute, art style in mind. Why else do you think there was a pink ghost? Other brands that use the kawaii style are Hello Kitty, Domokun, and Pokemon. Centipede also tried to pull women in using a pastel color scheme because of the personal taste of Centipede coder Donna Bailey. These appeals clearly worked because Pac-Man was my favorite video game when I was 3. My mother preferred Centipede. Both Pac-Man and Centipede had large female player bases. Similarly, the box art for video games' first mega-hit console, the Atari 2600, featured what today would be considered amazing diversity. Men and women, boys and girls, black people, white people, even an Asian kid. This was the first major home video game console, but modern opinion falsely believes that video games were somehow hardwired to appeal to white, heterosexual, cisgendered men. This is the linchpin of most modern video game criticism, a systemic oppression of women through a form of media for men. Meanwhile, we have historical evidence that this is just not the case. So, what the heck happened? Toy marketing. After the video game crash in the mid-1980s, Nintendo had to sneak their NES console through the stigma against video games by marketing it as a toy. Toys have a long history of being heavily gendered, so Nintendo had to make a choice whether it would market to girls or boys. Because the Nintendo Entertainment System came with a robot, they went with boys, though the early marketing for the console shows that their real target was families. And yet, Nintendo games used those same kawaii characters and pastel color palettes designed to appeal to women. The interesting thing is that video games began their rise in the West during a period in history with the lowest level of toy gendering ever, around 1975. Since then, toy gendering got progressively worse until a small recent correction. The gendering of toys is a shining example of de Beauvoir's second sex theory. There's Lego, then there's Lego for girls. There's building sets, then there's building sets for girls. Brands with their own sections, like Star Wars, the Avengers, and Batman, are split up. A Batgirl Barbie doll gets separated from the other Batman toys and ends up in the pink section because it's designed for girls. So if you're a toy maker and you want to maximize your potential shelf space, you make toys for boys because they're not limited to a single section of the store. That means that in practice, the boys' toys are treated as toys for kids, while girls' toys are treated as only for girls. This impacts not just how toys are stocked, but which characters get made and in what quantities. It's a glaring case of marketplace bias, and it creates an unnatural barrier between boys' interests and girls' interests. General boy-focused brands like superheroes and Star Wars can cross over the pink barrier into girl world, but you don't see the reverse happen because products for girls are stigmatized. De Beauvoir gave us the tools to understand why. She referred to women as the privileged other, determined by the way the one chooses to posit himself. Okay, what does that mean? Following de Beauvoir, it may seem great that girls have their own section. This may seem like special treatment, but it's actually singling out female interests as lesser. Boys stereotypically say, "Ew, Barbie." Girls don't say, "Ew, Lego." Color-coded toys send messages to kids about what it means to be a boy and a girl. And in a world where there's Lego and girl Lego, Batgirl and Barbie Batgirl, and video games for girls, girls are sent the message that they are defined in opposition to males. In religious terms, Adam was made fully formed by God. Eve was then made from Adam's rib. Women are, in media parlance, the spin-off series. This is all crazy talk when you think about the fact that we're a binary reproductive species. We need men and women to make babies. It's not like Pac-Man and Ms. Pac-Man, where Pac-Man objectively was the original. We're talking about unnatural social primacy given to one half of the human population for little apparent reason. I'll talk about how this has impacted the world of work in the upcoming episode on the feminine mystique. Othering is important to understand when we talk about including women in games. A lot of current inclusion strategies are the equivalent of the pink section of the toy store in that they treat women as a privileged other. The assumption is that video games will have to significantly change to appeal to women by things like making games easier, involve fewer buttons, or toning down the violence in the characters' bra cup sizes. The assumption is that it's weird that a girl would want to play with Batman. Why wouldn't a girl want to play with Batman? Because he's male and therefore not like her? Spend any time learning about slash fiction communities and you'll be disabused of that notion. Slash fiction is fan fiction that focuses on non-canonical romantic relationships between characters of the same sex. And there's a lot of batslash. Slash fiction is overwhelmingly written and consumed by women, but the characters in the stories are overwhelmingly male. Based on these communities, games seeking to appeal to women should involve more interpersonal content, feelings, private moments, sharing of deep, dark secrets, that sort of thing, preferably between gay men. If my work in media has taught me anything, it's that mainstream media doesn't service existing male and female fantasies. It peddles the fantasies that it thinks we're supposed to want. These messages are what de Beauvoir and other existentialists refer to as situation, the total context in which a given person comes to maturity. One is not born a man. One is born male and molded into what we understand about masculinity. One is not born a woman. One becomes one. Gender is a collection of learned behaviors. The lessons just start so young that we're not aware of them. Way back in the 1940s, de Beauvoir identified that female desires are poorly understood, and she personally did a lot of field research on this point, including some pretty questionable threesomes with her, Jean-Paul Sartre, and her much younger female students. Behavior we understand today is exploitative, but questionable personal behavior factored in, there's a lot to back up de Beauvoir's idea that gender isn't a naturally dominant determining factor in a woman's life. A woman's other identifiers and interests are washed away in a tidal wave of gendered social pressures. De Beauvoir connects this othering message to what she claims is female narcissism, the setting up of the ego as a double stranger. The adolescent girl becomes an object, and she sees herself as an object. She discovers this new aspect of her being with surprise. It seems to her that she's been doubled. Instead of coinciding exactly with herself, she now begins to exist outside. Okay, again, what does that mean? Gaming reference to the rescue! In the game Alan Wake, there's the protagonist, a kind of boring author with writer's block, and a much more exciting but villainous composite of the media stories about Alan Wake, a dark half called Mr. Scratch. Mr. Scratch personifies Alan's awareness that what the media says about him has taken on a life of its own. Even though it's untrue, it has power. Alan Wake is so objectified by the press that the game literally splits his ego into this double stranger paradigm. He's held responsible for this creation of the media that people think is him, and that so distracts him from who he really is that he can no longer connect with his actual self. Hence the writer's block. Aren't gaming metaphors great for explaining difficult concepts? Identity to de Beauvoir and to existentialists in general, is a dialogue with the self. When one sees the self as both self and other, Alan Wake and Mr. Scratch, that's the doubling that de Beauvoir is talking about. So why is this a problem? Because thinking about yourself as a self and an other at the same time leads to cognitive dissonance. This is why teenage girls are so appearance fixated and insecure. It's also why I believe that to truly integrate women into the video game community, we need to stop referring to ourselves as girl gamers. To call someone a girl gamer is to indicate that girl is not a state inherent to gamer. The term is self and other at the same time. If the feminine is inherent to the gamer identity, there's no need for a modifying word. As another example, Hawk from Dragon Age 2 appears as male on the box art, so the female version of the character got nicknamed Femhawk. Meanwhile, Dragon Age Origins and Inquisition shipped with gender-neutral cover art. There is no Fem Warden or Fem Inquisitor. There's just the Grey Warden and the Inquisitor. We need to get to the point that gamers who are women are the Grey Warden, not Femhawk. Female gamers are as much gamers by default as men who play a lot of video games. This isn't negated by the fact that some women enjoy seeing themselves as a girl gamer, since de Beauvoir's theories include how a woman sees herself as well as how the world sees her. De Beauvoir's ideal, which is central to classical feminist thinking, is that women stop seeing themselves as riveted to her body. Gaming is, I believe, a great exercise in healthy out-of-body experiences. I can be Geralt of Rivia, Kratos, Nathan Drake, Johnny Topsider, and Booker DeWitt. These games allow me to experience fictional social interactions without the second sex effect. Through playing video games, I've discovered that my first reactions to situations are socialized more male than female. This has led to a lot of shame tactics sent my way. The gendered slurs, bitch, whore, ice queen, slut, dragon lady, and so on are all designed to intimidate women back into that traditional feminine mold of being passive, agreeable, and defined in comparison to the men in their lives. The amazing power of fantasy video games is that they can create archetypes from these slurs. Flemeth from Dragon Age is a literal dragon lady. And of course, there's Elsa from Disney's Frozen, the literal embodiment of the Ice Queen insult. These characters aren't positioned as antagonists, so they allow women who defy social programming to see their differences as positives. Without these tropes, anomalous women have no way of defining ourselves in fictional realms. We're othered by a lack of representation. I believe that Flemeth is a uniquely important video game character because she deviates from the crone trope in that crones tend to be symbols of women who traditionally are beyond their fertile, sexually desirable years. Fertility and womanhood are linked in ways that aren't always healthy, and this was something that was of particular interest to de Beauvoir. De Beauvoir had a strong dislike, to put it lightly, of the rigid structures motherhood places on women. Reproduction seemed to outright disgust her. I think she would have loved Flemeth as a character because she's simultaneously goddess, matron, mother, and crone, and she doesn't give up her womanhood in exchange for enlightenment, even though this refusal to compromise makes her vilified. There are some common false assumptions when it comes to stages of womanhood, and de Beauvoir lashed out against these with particular passion. Assumption: the vast majority of women want to reproduce. Assumption: once women become mothers, that becomes the prime motivating force in our lives. Assumption: a woman will do anything in her power to protect her child, even sacrificing herself in the process. Lily Potter is the embodiment of the perfect media mother. She has no apparent aspirations other than motherhood. Her greatest power is that she loves and is loved, and she dies young protecting her son. She's the Virgin Mary as woman in refrigerator. We don't have to reject the character for this reason, but it's important to recognize the feminine virtue signaling that goes on in Harry Potter. Lily has no substance as a person. Her role is as a protective force over her son and a redemptive force for Severus Snape. These were the qualities associated with motherhood that seemed to make Simone de Beauvoir want to barf. Getting back to game design, it's also lazy character writing. It's a lot easier to write a dead character than a living one because dead characters exist in a fixed state. Dead moms are all over video games and other forms of media for a couple of reasons. In medieval times, when many Western storytelling traditions were formed, maternal mortality rates were high, about 1 to 3% risk per birth. This may seem small, but with birth rates of 4 to 8 children per woman, a woman's cumulative risk of dying in childbirth was anywhere from 4 to 24%, with the risk increasing with every child. We're talking about mortality rates in mothers comparable to modern-day Afghanistan. But also, what goes on in the minds of moms is little understood because the taboos against momming wrong are so strong. Very few writers are talented enough to convincingly write the other, so it's easier to kill off mom so that she's more of a plot device than a character in and of herself. There are as many types of mothers as there are types of people because, surprise, mothers are people, but you don't tend to see much complexity in the portrayals of mothers, and when you do see a complex media mom, there's backlash. Anna Gunn, the actress who played Skylar White on Breaking Bad, wrote an op-ed in the New York Times about the hate she received from fans of the show. Vince Gilligan should be credited for creating a complex female character, but Skylar's problem is that she was set up in the show to be the only opposition that her husband faces that he can't solve through murder or a threat of murder. She therefore becomes Walt's most formidable opponent. But we don't spend nearly enough time with Skylar for audiences to form the same bond with her that they do with Walt. Audiences became so convinced by Walter White's oft-repeated cliche that everything he did for his family, that they couldn't deprogram the idea that Skylar was just a nagging wife, even though, spoiler alert, Walt admits at the end of the series that everything he did for himself. Other cable shows have a similar problem with wives as antagonists. Carmela Soprano and Betty Draper have similar hate clubs. De Beauvoir would probably analyze this strange phenomenon as an example of women as the other. Tony Soprano, Don Draper, and Walter White are the main characters of their programs, the self of the show. Their wives only exist in relation to them as the protagonist, so the wives are the other. But it's also gender programming involving which gender is supposed to be the primary actor in society. Men are, in gaming terms, the tanks. Women are the support classes. In non-gamer terms, men are the providers, women are the nurturers. So it's okay that Walter White manufactures highly potent drugs, commits murder, has hitmen break into his house multiple times, and abducts his own daughter, as long as he claims to be doing it to provide for his family. It wasn't okay, in the eyes of the audience, for his wife Skylar to defy him, because this also defies her traditional role as wife and mother. Walt's myth was more important to audiences than Skylar's reality. All of this is totally consistent with Simone de Beauvoir's observations. Representation of the world, like the world itself, is the work of men. They describe it from their own point of view, which they confuse with the absolute truth. It is not in giving life, but in risking life, that man is raised above the animal, which is why superiority has been accorded in humanity not to the sex that brings forth, but to that which kills. Society cares for the individual only so far as he is profitable. Video games have done a lot of interesting work in exploring relationships with fathers. BioShock, Gears of War, Splinter Cell, Uncharted, and the Tomb Raider reboots deal with complex relationships involving fatherhood and surrogate fatherhood. Even the Witcher series, which started off with a protagonist who was an amoral cynic, matured and humanized him and the games through a relationship with a surrogate daughter, Ciri. Stories about mothers are much harder to come by. King's Quest VII, way back in 1994, had a mother as a playable character, and one of the gameplay mechanics was making her cry to solve a particular puzzle. In the video game catalog, there are very few playable moms. Most are in fighting games. Sophitia, Crimson Viper, and Nina Williams all defy stereotypes regarding moms. But the most, pardon the pun, developed fighter mom is Sonya Blade in Mortal Kombat X or 10 or whatever you want to call it. Sonya is the military general. Her ex-husband Johnny Cage stayed home with their daughter Cassie. Sonya is a tough-as-nails mom, but it's pretty clear she loves her daughter even though their relationship is unconventional and somewhat strained. Sonya doesn't just see herself as equal to men. She sees herself as a leader of men. Guys, if Mortal Kombat can create an interesting, nuanced portrayal of a mother in a game about beating the crap out of kung fu movie tropes, everybody else needs to seriously step up their game. Another interesting gaming storyline for a mother is one that isn't talked about much, that of Samara in Mass Effect 2. Samara has to hunt down her daughter Morinth, who's murdering people. Her loyalty mission in Mass Effect 2 involves the gut-wrenching emotions inherent to that quest. Samara, however, is not maudlin about her emotions. She adheres to a strict moral code as an Asari Justicar, which comes first in her life, though she very much loves her daughters. Samara defies numerous motherhood stereotypes and is an interesting, complex character accordingly. Of course, her race, the Asari, are a monogendered species. Their idea of motherhood is different because they don't have a fatherhood role. I think Simone de Beauvoir would have loved the Asari because her ideal feminist society was one where the man can be the mother. The Asari are a fictional thought experiment of a race that has no men, but that the player relates to as female. And yet the Asari have defined life cycle phases consistent with de Beauvoir's idea that one is not born a woman, one becomes one. The Asari are freed from the body and sex and freed from the cage of motherhood, in that they often raise their children alone. They don't even have gendered military separations, and Asari commandos are tough combatants. The sheer number of memorable Asari characters, Liara Tassoni, Samara, Morinth, Arya Talok, and Liara's mother, Matriarch Benezia, even that bartender with a Krogan father, maybe because the Mass Effect writers didn't have gender as a crutch, so they had to think about Asari characters as individuals instead of characters that say something about womanhood. This brings another de Beauvoir quote to mind. Man is defined as a human being, and a woman as a female. Whenever she behaves as a human being, she is said to imitate the male. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't think game developers have deliberately set out to exclude moms or create boring female characters. There's just extra baggage when you put a female character in a game that's even more intense when that woman is a mother. A single Kotaku article from 2009 shows the harsh criticisms mothers face. Crimson Viper was crowned the worst mother in fighting games because she's a workaholic who doesn't always call her kid after fights. Let's recap. The Street Fighter team bothered to include a single working mom in their game and was criticized for the realities of working single moms. Jasmine Jolene, the exploited showgirl in BioShock, was also dubbed the worst mom in shooter games for defying Andrew Ryan. Way to go, Kotaku. You condemned a woman for controlling her own reproductive rights and trying to seek financial independence from the man who eventually murdered her. The press hasn't eased off complaining about the depictions of women in video games since 2009. The complaints have just changed. Every female video game character created today is subject to a strict, hypercritical femininity checklist that requires them to be nonviolent, small-busted, sexually chaste, and modestly dressed, or else. This absolutely defies de Beauvoir. De Beauvoir rejected Aristotle's statement that the female is a female by virtue of a certain lack of qualities. But Aristotle's view is exactly how the most popular feminist critics are treating female video game characters. One of the few feminist frequency approved female characters in video games is the Scythian, who is practically unrecognizable as human. This isn't an isolated incident either. Chell was praised for being a glorified camera in Portal. Lara Croft, Kitana, and Melina were seen as improved when their breasts shrunk. Women in video games are being praised for looking less female. Their lack of qualities, following Aristotle, is seen as virtuous. We're also losing prostitutes in video games, a female trope de Beauvoir saw as defiant of the three accepted places for women in society: wife, mother, or entertainer. De Beauvoir was adamant that the oppression of women meant that women's characters didn't create their situations. Their situations form their characters. The stigmatization of prostitutes is rooted in slut-shaming, and slut-shaming is rooted in the judgment that a woman who is sexually liberated makes an unsuitable wife. So this slamming of digital prostitutes basically comes down to, don't have sex for money because then boys won't like you. See why de Beauvoir thought marriage was linked to feminine oppression? To paraphrase my Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, it's 2016. Gay people can get married. Trans people are starting to be recognized as, people. And game critics still love to criticize any female character with a noticeable personality, sexual aggressiveness, immodest dress, or boobs. They've thrown us back to Aristotle's virtue of a certain lack of qualities. Meanwhile, rank-and-file gamers are saying, we don't care if she's a hooker or a hairdresser as long as she's a good character. Gamers are more in line with de Beauvoir than the critics. Simone de Beauvoir's work is complex, but the core understanding that I think she was aiming for is simple. Women are people, and any habit that causes someone to think about women based on what makes us different from men, instead of focusing on common understandings, is denying us that personhood. No, men are not from Mars and women are not from Venus. We were all born on Earth before the world started shoving us into different color-coded playpens. Most people are products of their situations, their conditioning. They'll take the easiest path open to them, often the family business, whether that family business is medicine, law, the military, entertainment, or anything else. It's the most convenient path open to a child of either gender. It takes a lot more time, money, and effort to deviate from a path of normalcy than to follow it. So the vast majority of people will remain gender conforming as well as conforming to other social factors. But there are those for whom the norms just don't work. And it's important to remember that long hair and a pink dress don't make you a woman, and six-pack abs and a sports car don't make you a man. These are trappings of gender, but they don't have to be a trap. Just judge individuals as individuals.